The first thing Kest Vorai expected when the human medic knelt over his shattered body was a blade across his throat. What he got instead was a name. "Hold still," the human said. In the flat, accented Skarn dialect, the coalition had spent a decade learning just well enough to be understood. "You're Kest Vorai, serial numbers on your flight harness. I'm not going to ask you anything until you're not bleeding out of your side anymore." Kest did not understand. The lattice screamed inside his skull, the frantic, dying resonance of his crashed wingpod, the last echoes of his hivekin retreating from the battlefield without him. He was alone in a way no Skarn had ever been alone, cut off from the collective hum that had lived behind his thoughts since birth. And the last transmission he had received before the silence swallowed him whole was a directive from the grave sky. Hive Mother herself, die before capture. A Skarn taken alive is a Skarn who has failed the swarm. He had failed. He was lying in human mud, human hands pressing a sealant patch against a wound that should have killed him, and the human was talking to him like he mattered. He decided, somewhere in the fog of blood loss, that this had to be a cruelty he did not yet understand. Humans were famous across a dozen fronts for their strangeness, and every Skarn commander had a theory about what lay beneath it. Some said humans tortured captives slowly to break the lattice itself, hoping to reach back through a prisoner's mind into the hive. Others said humans simply enjoyed cruelty dressed as kindness, the way a predator sometimes played with something it intended to eat. Kest believed the second theory. He believed it for exactly 41 days. The Skarn Dominion had been expanding for 300 years the way a wildfire expands. Not through conquest exactly, but through absorption. Species that resisted were burned away. Species that surrendered were folded into the hive's endless, humming productivity. Their old names quietly retired, their old languages left to die with the last generation that remembered them. It was not cruelty, by Skarn reckoning. It was efficiency. The lattice did not have room for grief, and a species without grief has very little use for mercy either. Hive Mother Ixarel had built her entire war doctrine on a single, unshakable axiom, drilled into every drone from the moment of hatching: kindness is a currency, and every currency can be spent against you. An enemy who showed mercy was an enemy revealing where they could be exploited. An enemy who protected the weak was an enemy who could be made to trade a fleet for a single hostage. Ixarel had broken 4 warrior civilizations using exactly that principle, and she saw no reason humanity would prove any different. Then the coalition began the war for the Vantage Reach, a scattering of mining colonies at the edge of contested space, and something in Ixarel's calculations started, very quietly, to fail. It began small. A captured Skarn scout, expected to die of neglect or interrogation, was returned 3 months later during a prisoner exchange, alive, unharmed, and speaking passable coalition standard. Ixarel's war council dismissed it as an anomaly, a single soft-hearted commander disobeying doctrine. Then it happened again, and again. Word moved through the lattice the way rumors move through any gossiping crowd, distorted and half-believed. The humans did not simply hold Skarn prisoners, the humans adopted them. Colonel Yusuf Bark ran the Vantage Reach's prisoner integration program the way he ran everything, quietly, patiently, and with a stubbornness that had outlasted 3 different coalition administrations that had each, at different points, tried to shut the whole thing down as reckless. "You're not a prisoner here," he told Kest. On the 4th day, through a translation drone that rendered his voice into something close enough to lattice cadence that Kest's instincts recognized it as speech rather than noise. "You're a guest who hasn't agreed to stay yet. I killed 9 of your soldiers at the Halcyon Crossing Kest said. It was the only thing he had said in 4 days that wasn't a demand to be executed cleanly. I flew the wing pod that broke your eastern line. I am the reason 40 humans are dead. I know, Bakra said. I read the report. Then why does no one hurt me? Bakra considered the question the way a man considers something he has been asked many times before by many different prisoners, and has never found an answer short enough to satisfy. Because hurting you wouldn't undo any of it, he said finally. And because somewhere in your hive, right now, there's a story going around about what happens to Skarn who get captured by humans. We'd like that story to be true. Kest did not understand that answer either, not yet. Colonel Yusuf Bak ran the Vantage Reach's prisoner integration program the way he ran everything, quietly, patiently, and with a stubbornness that had outlasted 3 different coalition administrations that had each, at different points, tried to shut the whole thing down as reckless. You're not a prisoner here, he told Kest. On the 4th day, through a translation drone that rendered his voice into something close enough to lattice cadence that Kest's instincts recognized it as speech rather than noise. You're a guest who hasn't agreed to stay yet. I killed 9 of your soldiers at the Halcyon crossing, Kest said. It was the only thing he had said in 4 days that wasn't a demand to be executed cleanly. I flew the wing pod that broke your eastern line. I am the reason 40 humans are dead. I know, Bakra said. I read the report. Then why does no one hurt me? Bakra considers the question the way a man considers something he has been asked many times before by many different prisoners and has never found an answer short enough to satisfy. Because hurting you wouldn't undo any of it, he said finally. And because somewhere in your hive, right now, there's a story going around about what happens to Skarn who get captured by humans. We'd like that story to be true. Kest did not understand that answer either. Not yet. The Coalition called it the Halcyon Doctrine, named for the first battle where it had been tested, more than a decade before Kest was ever hatched. It was not, as the Skarn War Council assumed, a strategy designed to weaken enemy morale through manipulation. It had started as something far smaller and far more human, a grieving coalition unit, after a battle that had cost them their commanding officer, finding themselves standing over the wounded enemy soldier responsible for his death, and choosing, in a moment none of them could fully explain afterward, not to kill him. They gave him their captain's old name instead, not as mockery, as inheritance. It became policy almost by accident, and then almost by conviction. Enemy soldiers captured in circumstances that took a coalition life were assigned whenever they consented to integration into that fallen soldier's own family unit, not as a servant, not as a trophy, but as something the coalition's own psychologists struggled for years to name accurately in official reports. The closest word anyone ever settled on was kin. It was, on its surface, an act of impossible mercy toward the very people who had taken the most from them. Underneath, it was something colder and more deliberate than mercy, a refusal to let the war manufacture an unbroken chain of enemies. A dead soldier's family did not receive a folded flag and an empty house. They received a stranger who had ended one life and now, whether he wanted it or not, was bound to help carry the family that life had left behind. Kest Vorai had been the pilot who killed Corporal Mateo Reyes. He was, under the Halcyon Doctrine, now the Reyes family's responsibility. He did not learn this until the 7th week, and when he did, it very nearly ended him. Naomi Reyes was not what Kest expected a grieving widow to look like. He had built an image of her out of Skarn assumptions about human sentiment, a creature broken by loss, easily manipulated, desperate for anything that resembled her dead mate. Instead, she stood in the doorway of a modest colony house on the edge of Vantage Station, arms crossed, studying him with an expression that held no visible hatred and no visible warmth either, just assessment. The same look Kest imagined a Hive scout might give an unfamiliar signal before deciding whether it was worth reporting. "You're the one," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am," Kest said. There was no reason to lie. Backer had told him lying here would cost him more than the truth ever could. "Do you know who I am?" Colonel Backer told me. "You are the mate of the human I killed." Something moved across her face, not tears, not rage, something quieter and harder to read. "His name was Matteo," she said. "You'll use it." "I understand." "You don't," she said. "Not yet. But you will." She stepped aside from the door. Behind her, a boy of perhaps 10 years stood in the hallway, watching Kest with the frank, unguarded curiosity of a child who had not yet been taught that he was supposed to be afraid. "That's Theo," Naomi said. "He asked to meet you." I told him he didn't have to. He insisted. "Why would he want to meet the one who—" "Because he has questions only you can answer," Naomi said. "And because pretending you don't exist doesn't bring his father back. It just means we spend the rest of our lives flinching at a shadow instead of learning to live next to a person." Kest did not have a word in the lattice for what he felt standing in that doorway. The closest translation, years later, when he had finally learned enough Coalition Standard to explain it properly, was something close to vertigo. The sensation of an entire architecture of belief tilting sideways beneath him, without yet collapsing. For the first several weeks, Kest assumed the household's calm was a performance, something maintained for his benefit until the real punishment arrived. He waited for the moment the mask would drop, for Naomi's grief to curdle into cruelty, for Theo's curiosity to turn to accusation, for Backer's patient mentorship to reveal itself as a longer, more elaborate interrogation. The moment never came. Instead, smaller things happened, each one a fresh disorientation. Theo asked him on the 9th night to help repair a broken drone toy that had belonged to his father. Not because Kest understood human technology better than anyone else in the household, but because Dad always fixed things instead of throwing them away, and you're the closest thing I've got to him now, even if that's weird. Naomi asked him on the 17th day to help her plant a row of colony crops that Matteo had started the season before he died, not out of forgiveness, she made clear, but because the crops didn't care whose hands finished the planting, and someone needed to finish it. Backer asked him nothing at all for the first month, only sat with him some evenings on the station's observation deck, watching the same 2 moons rise, saying very little, until Kest finally asked why the colonel bothered spending time with a soldier who had killed dozens of his people. "Because somebody sat with me once," Backer said. "A long time ago, on a different front, when I'd done things I couldn't live with. He didn't forgive me. He just made sure I wasn't alone with it. Seemed worth passing along." Kest turned that answer over for a long time, in the silent hours when the lattice's absence from his mind felt less like an amputation and more, disturbingly, like room. The Hive Mother's War Council did not believe the reports at first. Skarn intelligence filtering rumor and half-verified signal traffic out of the vantage reach painted a picture that violated every axiom the Dominion's entire military doctrine rested on. Captured Skarn soldiers were not dying in human camps. They were not being tortured for Hive intelligence. They were, according to the most reliable reports, being folded into human households, given human names alongside their own, taught human customs, in several documented cases, even permitted to correspond, carefully monitored, but permitted, with Hive kin still fighting on the front. "This is a trap," argued War Marshal Threx, Ixarel's most senior commander, during the council session where the intelligence was first presented in full. "A prisoner who feels obligated to a human family becomes a prisoner who will lie for that family. This is exploitation dressed as kindness." Exactly as doctrine predicts. Then why? Asked a younger officer, one of the few present who had actually served alongside Kest before his capture. Do none of the returned prisoners lie? Every exchange soldier's account matches. Every one of them describes the same doctrine, the same practice, independently, with no possibility of coordination. If this were manipulation, Marshal, it would require a coherence humans have never demonstrated in any other theater of this war. Ixarel said nothing during that exchange. She listened, the way she always listened before deciding a doctrine needed re-examining, and gave no indication of which way she was leaning. It would be months before anyone in her council understood that the Hive Mother had already begun, quietly, to test an uncomfortable hypothesis that the humans were not lying about their strangest practice, and that this might be far more dangerous than if they had been. The reversal came in Kest's 11th week, on a night he had not expected to change anything. Theo could not sleep. Kest found him sitting on the back step of the colony house, staring up at the two moons with the particular stillness of a child working up the courage to ask something enormous. "Can I ask you something about the battle?" Theo said. "The one where you—" He started again. "The one at the crossing." "You may ask anything," Kest said. He had learned, by then, not to flinch from the question he assumed was coming. Did my dad know before it happened? Did he know he wasn't going to make it? Kest was quiet for a long moment. He had relived the battle at Halcyon Crossing more times than he could count, in the sealed, private hours when the lattice's silence gave his thoughts nowhere else to go. He remembered the moment with a clarity that had not faded, only sharpened. "Your father's unit was pinned beneath collapsed cover," Kest said carefully. "My wing pod had a clear target. I fired. But in the half-second before I fired, I saw him push another soldier out from beneath the falling debris. A soldier who was not his, a coalition medic from a different unit entirely, someone he had no obligation to. He used the time he could have spent taking cover to save someone else instead. That is why my shot found him and not the medic. He chose that outcome. I only delivered it." Theo was very quiet. "That sounds like him," he said finally. "He was always doing that. Mum used to get so mad at him for it." "I did not know that," Kest said. "I only saw the last second of it. I have carried it as my worst act for 11 weeks. I did not know it was also the truest act of who he was." "Does that make it easier?" Theo asked. "Knowing that?" "No," Kest admitted, "but it makes it clear. And I did not understand, until this moment, that your family did not integrate me out of ignorance of what I did. Colonel Bacher said something to me on my first day that I dismissed as strangeness. He said your doctrine was built precisely for soldiers like me, not despite what we had done, but because of it. I believe this was manipulation. I now believe it was something else. A refusal to let what I did become the only thing that is ever true about me." Theo looked at him for a long moment, in the pale double moonlight, with an expression far older than his years. "Dad would have liked you," he said. "He liked people who told the truth, even when it cost them something." It was the first time since his capture that Kest Vorai understood, fully and without reservation, that he had never actually been a prisoner at all. The escalation arrived 8 months later, delivered not by coalition intelligence, but by the lattice itself. Every Skarn carried, buried deep beneath conscious thought, a neural resonance link that could never be fully severed, a biological failsafe the Dominion had cultivated across generations, designed so that even isolated soldiers could, under the right conditions, be reached by the Hive collective one final time. It was meant for retrieval operations. It was meant, in cases of deep necessity, for something else entirely. Hive Mother Ixarel had spent the better part of a year quietly developing a doctrine of her own, one built on the uncomfortable data her war council had gathered about the Halcyon program. If humans would not abandon integrated prisoners, if they treated them as genuine kin rather than expendable leverage, then those prisoners represented something the Dominion had never before possessed against a human target: soldiers embedded, trusted, and beloved inside the very households and command structures the Coalition was fighting to protect. Ixaral did not intend to exploit that trust through violence. She intended something colder. A single activation of the deep lattice link forced through every integrated Skarn soldier simultaneously, compelling each of them, whether they wished it or not, to transmit everything they had learned of Coalition defenses, family structures, colony vulnerabilities, back to the Hive in the instant before a full invasion of the Vantage Reach began. It would not require a single one of them to betray their adopted families willingly. It would simply require the Dominion to reach into their minds and take it. Kest felt the activation arrive the way a person feels the first tremor of an earthquake, a wrongness in the body before the mind has named it. The lattice, silent in him for the better part of a year, roared back to life all at once, no longer a gentle collective hum, but a directive, absolute and inescapable. Threading through every neural pathway that had once made him Skarn before it had made him anything else. Transmit. Every location. Every vulnerability. Every name. He was standing in the Reyes kitchen when it hit him. Naomi was setting the table. Theo, 15 now, taller, was arguing cheerfully with him about whether a Coalition strategy game favored infantry or artillery. The ordinary, unbearable smallness of the moment made what was happening in his skull feel like a violation of something sacred. He felt his own mouth begin, without his consent, to recite coordinates. Kest? Naomi's voice, sharp with sudden alarm. Kest, your eyes. He gripped the edge of the table. The lattice pulled harder, 1,000 Hivekin voices at once, the closest thing to home he had ever known, demanding the one thing he had left that was entirely his own, the location of the family that had spent 8 years teaching him what a name was actually worth. He had, buried in memory from his training decades before, one piece of knowledge every Skarn drone pilot carried and almost none ever used. The failsafe could be resisted, but only by severing the deep link manually at the base of the neural cluster with a method that carried no guarantee the soldier attempting it would survive the procedure. He looked at Theo, at Naomi, at the small, ordinary kitchen that had somehow become the entire world he was no longer willing to trade for the hive that made him. "I need a blade," he said, his voice already fracturing under the strain of the two competing signals tearing through his skull. "Now, please." The procedure Kest performed on himself, at the kitchen table of the family whose father he had killed, was not clean and was not certain. Naomi held him upright, while Theo, hands shaking, followed instructions relayed in half-coherent fragments between waves of pain that left Kest's vision white with static. The blade found the neural cluster at the base of his skull on the second attempt. The lattice's roar cut out mid-transmission, taking with it, in the same violent instant, every trace of the ambient hive hum Kest had carried since before he could remember being anything else. He woke 3 days later in a Coalition medical bay with Colonel Backer sitting beside his bed, the same patient posture he'd held on the observation deck all those months ago. "You cut yourself off from your own species," Backer said, "to protect a family that wasn't yours by blood, from an attack that would have used your own mind as the weapon. Command wants to know why. Because somewhere between the crossing and this bed," Kest said, "I stopped believing there was a difference between the two things you just said." The invasion Ixaral had planned around a single coordinated transmission from every integrated prisoner collapsed within the hour. Its intelligence network gutted, by dozens of soldiers who, faced with the same choice Kest had faced, made the same decision independently and without coordination, severing the failsafe link at whatever cost, rather than betray the families the Halcyon doctrine had bound them to. 3 did not survive the procedure. 11 suffered permanent damage they would carry the rest of their lives. Every single one of them chose it anyway. Ixarel received the reports in the silence of her own war chamber, and for the first time in 300 years of Dominion expansion, found herself without a doctrine that could explain what she was looking at. Her entire strategy had rested on an axiom so foundational it had never once been questioned. Kindness is a currency, spendable, exploitable, always eventually reclaimable by whoever offered it. She had waited a year to spend the currency the humans had unwittingly handed her. She had discovered, too late, that it had never been a loan at all. It was something the Skarn had no accurate word for, because the Dominion had spent 300 years ensuring its soldiers never learned to want it. The war for the Vantage Reach did not end in a single battle. It ended, unevenly, and over several more years, in a slow unraveling of Dominion morale that no coalition weapon had ever managed to achieve. Word moved through the lattice the way it always had, distorted first, then gradually confirmed, that Skarn soldiers taken prisoner by the Halcyon doctrine were not dying, were not being exploited, were in several documented and undeniable cases choosing, when given the option to return home, to stay. Surrender rates along the Vantage Front rose steadily for 2 years, not because coalition forces grew stronger, but because Skarn soldiers began, quietly and at growing personal risk, seeking capture rather than victory, a phenomenon Dominion Command had no framework to counter, because it could not be solved by better weapons or tighter discipline. It could only be solved by becoming a civilization capable of offering something the Halcyon doctrine had offered for free. Hive Mother Ixarel never publicly conceded the war. She simply, in her final address to the War Council before her quiet retirement from command, ordered the Dominion's historians to begin recording something the Lattice had never before required: individual names, kept separate from the collective record for any soldier who requested it. It was not mercy exactly. It was the first uncertain step toward learning what mercy might cost and whether the Dominion could survive the debt. Kest Vorai stood at Theo Reyes's graduation from the Coalition Officer Academy 11 years after the kitchen where he had first learned what a blade could cost a person willing to pay it. Naomi stood beside him, grey-haired now, her hand resting briefly on his arm, the way it had rested there 1,000 times over a decade of ordinary mornings neither of them had expected to survive to see. "He's going to fly wing pods now," she said, watching her son cross the stage. "Same as his father did before the Coalition switched him to infantry. Same as you did before all of this. He asked me for advice before the ceremony," Kest said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the same thing Colonel Barker told me, the first week I understood I wasn't a prisoner. I told him that the worst thing anyone had ever done could still be the beginning of the truest thing they ever became, but only if someone was willing to sit beside them long enough to find out which one it would be." Naomi looked at him for a long moment, the 2 moons rising behind the academy spires, exactly as they had risen over a small colony house more than a decade before. "Matteo would have liked that answer," she said. "I know," Kest said. "He's the one who taught it to me. He just didn't live long enough to say it himself." The Skarn Dominion had a word once for anyone taken alive by an enemy in war. It meant, roughly translated, the lost. After the Vantage Reach, after the failsafe severed at a kitchen table by a soldier who chose a family over a hive, after 11 years of surrender rates the Dominion's own historians could not fully explain, the old word quietly fell out of use. They never did agree, in all the years that followed, on what word should replace it. But for the first time in 300 years, they started looking for one.